Welcome to the IR Digital Podcast, a part of IR Global, the largest international professional services network. I'm your host of the IR Digital Podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today, we are talking to Doug DePeppe of eosedge Legal. We are talking about taking cybersecurity from data privacy to data property, which is a whole new concept to me, and how to use emerging technologies like blockchain, which I know is an overwhelming idea, but we will make it clear to everybody to enable this sort of collective enforcement. It's a really interesting conversation, I think, and I think it's just getting to ideas that we're not talking about enough, especially from the legal or business perspective, but maybe we are talking about too much in the tech space. So to kick us off, welcome, Doug. Why don't you just give us your background?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for hosting. Looking forward to this. I think it'll be interesting. My background, I've cut my teeth, so to speak, in cyber law. That's really my specialty, is the intersection of both cybersecurity and data and law. So I cut my teeth in the U.S. Army as a judge advocate years ago, really at the onset of Web 2, the commercial internet, and the cybersecurity dimensions that were occurring. But since about 2009, then I moved over to U.S. Department of Homeland Security and again, practicing cyber law. But since about 2010, 2011, I've been in private practice, both consulting, practicing law, and focusing almost exclusively on data privacy. I'm going to change that term in a minute, but data privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, cyber law. So that's my background.
Okay, I love a baseline definition, journalist by trade. What is data privacy to you, and what is data protection?
Sure. So when I said I want to change the dialogue away from data privacy, not entirely, but in terms of framing the conversation, I prefer to use the term identity and digital identity. And because you introduced the idea of having a discussion around treating privacy from a property context, and I think it's really helpful to understand that notion by first treating the issue as an identity issue. And I'll extrapolate there and get everybody on board. But I guess I just want to first stop and mention that really what I'm looking to accomplish here, and I hope that the audience finds this interesting, is to focus on two items. The first, because I think this puts it in the context, and I think there's widespread interest in there. Because I think with some, you mentioned blockchain, you mentioned cybersecurity, and I start to gloss over, and there's a perception this is going to be a deep dive into technology and things that people don't understand. So what I want to start off by saying is everyone has an interest in protecting their assets, whether it's personal assets, someone's identity, avoiding identity theft, or corporate assets. So there's always interest in protecting what you have. And then the second part is if you can protect what you have, but you have an opportunity to monetize it, to make money, then that's an added attraction. So first is protect what you have, and then are there opportunities to generate revenue off of data? So that's how I want to frame what I want to talk about, and then get into data protection, data privacy. So you asked the question of what's the difference between data protection and data privacy, and I responded by saying, let's talk about identity, and that's because at the outset of the internet, when we recognized that there were threats to networks and threats to data, the nature of that threat tended to be around invasions of privacy. So how do I protect my identity? How do I avoid identity theft? And so the protection is around the personality, protection of one's privacy, and that the threats to that were taking away someone's identity, taking away their privacy interests. And the problem with that, it wasn't wrong, but it was too narrow. too narrow in the sense that it's not just an invasion of your privacy. Justice Brandeis called privacy or referenced it as the right to be left alone. But now we have threats to one's namesake, an entity's brand. And so it's not just an invasion of someone's health information, and while that's certainly happening and that's a real threat, it's broader. It's a threat to intellectual property. It's a threat to identity and brand. If you're a celebrity, having your namesake ripped off or knocked off, and how do you protect that? And so moving it and looking at it more broadly as an identity issue introduces broader concepts. One other thing on privacy is the German code and others who at early century efforts on defining privacy went beyond how Justice Brandeis expressed it as the right to be left alone, but into one's personality, into human rights. And if that gets, again, that's an identity embracing concept, not just privacy. So to start off, I'll just say that I think it's really important for this conversation to look at the data concern, the data protection issue, as protecting not just privacy, but identity. Moreover, last point on that transition from privacy to identity, it's not just identity in the individual context. It's corporate identity, it's brand, right? So how do you protect digital assets that are associated with one's brand, whether that's one's identity or a corporate identity?
Okay. So there's a lot of questions I have already to clarify, because it's always good to clarify for the audience who's listening. At one point you said protect identity, make money potentially off of it. Are we speaking of an over 13 age, as is usually the social media age, or are we speaking at like a non-minor age, like 18 plus in the realm of this? A 13-year-old will happily sell their identity for money.
Right. Well, I mean, there's definitely the guardian, the parent angle to whether someone is old enough and should be monetizing their identity. But what I'm concerned about is that the risks to identity they start at birth. That there's a need to protect data very early on. Whether there's a later on a decision to monetize data, that's an individual or a family consideration. But there are these threats to identity that occur at birth, and the need to so I guess it's stake a claim around one's identity or a corporate identity so that you protect that asset. And then if there's a desire to move toward generating revenue off of identity, but you first have to protect it. You first have to stake a claim.
Okay. And that brings me my next question. When you talk about identity and potentially profiting off of or choosing to profit off of it, are you talking about individuals, or are you talking more corporations that own data, or both for the purposes
it is
of conversation?
Yeah, no, it is both. I think there's opportunity, but I think that increasingly, like with the recent NCAA decision or the Supreme Court decision regarding the NCAA this past summer, of athletes, that they have a right to generate revenue if they choose to, notwithstanding their participation in NCAA sports. So what that gets to is, even though someone doesn't have brand value yet, because your question was about, is it a corporate opportunity or is it an individual opportunity? And I do think it's both. But at the early stages, one's brand, one's identity perhaps doesn't have value, right? And what the floodgates were open there with that Supreme Court decision, because a lot of athletes now, before they really have brand, see an opportunity to create brand and to begin to monetize themselves. And I think that opportunity is there for anyone with a novel idea, very much like intellectual property. It's an original idea, original work that you can monetize if you desire to. But you first have to start with protecting it, because increasingly with the internet, And with Web3 and blockchain, all kinds of opportunities, but all kinds of opportunities, and we're seeing already, for theft. And so with Web3, which is generally associated with notions of blockchain infrastructure, and I know I'm throwing some ideas out there that maybe people aren't fully conversant in. I guess I would just broadly say that the web is moving toward Web3. It's going to be more individual centric, but also the opportunity to lose one's identity at scale. And so the need to first protect identity and then look to monetize it. And I guess it's a good time to get to this notion of data as property.
But before that, just,
yeah, okay.
I just want to clarify, because the web is a nefarious, massive entity, like limitless. It could be potentially 7 billion identities or more on there. So I just want to clarify for the listeners, those that would be interested in this conversation, are we talking about a specific jurisdiction or more in the more nebulous web of as open and without borders we could talk? Or are we talking about in the US, or what jurisdictions maybe?
It's universal as blockchain is becoming universal. It is certainly jurisdictions will need to enhance their laws. Mm-hmm. But what blockchain affords, because of its the Web3 approach, there's this concept in blockchain called self-sovereign identity. It's associated with Web3, and it basically means that this is a sort of a high-level lay description of it. There are those who will probably quibble at the detail level, but what I'm seeing is that whereas Web 2, the commercial internet, and people will appreciate this, when you went to a site, whether it's social media, your bank profile, you had to create a profile, and that profile, based upon the terms of service, was generally owned by the entity. So you entered their property, and they helped you create a profile so they could identify you and authenticate you and provide you certain services. But that profile, if you think about it, is an extension of your identity. So why do they own a piece of your identity? I understand it's for access and for authentication, but certainly a number of social media platforms and other ways that identity has become commoditized and monetized by parties that don't own that data. And if we again get back to the notion of identity, why don't we own our own identity? Doesn't that go without saying? Isn't that expected? And what Web3 enables, and I mentioned self-sovereign identity, is for you to it's like bring your own identity, bring your own profile. And the opportunity therein is that if you have a single identity that moves with you across the internet, then you can own that data, you can own your identity, and you can potentially own all of your activity that extends from your identity. And what that means then is that potentially you own your cookies, you own your behavior. And what that notion is essentially a data as property notion. In other words, your identity extends from you into the internet. Not many people are going to dispute that people own their identity. That's established in international law. It's established in culture, religions. I mean, it's pretty widespread, pretty universal. What's doubtful, or has become doubtful because of our privacy approach to the law and data, is whether you own your digital identity. And yet it's an extension of yourself or extension of your brand. And so through Web3, there is an opportunity to own the entirety of one's digital identity. And if you think about that and unpack that, then that means that you can license it. Where you go, if you own that data, there are opportunities to license it. And really the utility token, the tokenization on the blockchain provides the mechanism to do that. And so what I just quickly jumped through a couple of ideas there. We've gone from privacy to identity, identity to digital identity to ownership of data. And then the next interesting and useful next stage of that is if you own your digital identity, you own your data, own it as property, then property law can protect your interests. And it's easier to enforce property rights than it is to enforce a privacy violation. That has been the historical challenge in the law of, and the cases keep, emerging in different legal opinions, decisions around privacy and whether you have concrete harm. But the point is that it's difficult to enforce your rights under a privacy regime, under a privacy contract. Whereas if you're looking to enforce your property ownership rights, that's easier because the other party is infringing upon your property.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There's a lot to process here, and I don't want to forget where I am in the processing, though it is an interesting discussion if Roe v. Wade precedent was based on property over the interpretation of privacy being a human right. Now, this is me taking back 20 years to pre-law. That would make a very different conversation right now. That would be very interesting. So I actually think the NCAA is an interesting example to try to tie through what you talked about. If I'm remembering what Nina Totenberg from NPR had said like 10 months ago when the verdict came out, there's two aspects of NCAA. It's wildly popular and wildly profit-making, especially basketball and American football, because they have advertising, but then they also use I don't even know if they have rights to use the imagery of some of these players in video games and things who aren't profiting off of that. So I believe the ruling didn't say exactly that players could be paid for it, but that they were owed other benefits that would help them with their education. Like if they play the viola, they could get, or if they need a computer for school, things like that, or even a car to commute to school would be an extension of that after the fact, not bribery to get into, to recruit them for that school, things like that. So that is what you're using as that example there, is that someone's talent basically or skill set could be an extension of their individual property. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court, I would just broadly characterize it as a pro free enterprise decision that athletes cannot be restricted from generating revenue off of what they bring as value. And so what now you're asking about this, and the term here is name, image, likeness, at least in the US. Image rights in certain parts of the world, name, image, likeness, or NIL in the US. And I think that's a really poignant example, an illustration of why it's property. Because if you were to hold up a photograph of yourself, or I were to hold up a picture of myself, few would dispute that that photograph was a piece of property. What's happened with the internet is that we've lost control of the indicia of ourselves, right, through data, so that are now the name, image, likeness, or our behavior online, or our communications, it goes into the ether world, and we lose control. And certainly there are legal considerations around, you're in the public commons, what can you own there? Fair enough, and that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we can get into at a later point. But the notion that if I have, think of Jim Craig, the hockey goalie, Miracle on Ice, wrapped in the U.S. flag after beating, the Soviets in the Olympic hockey final. I think that was '86. There's this iconic image of him. Well, at the moment, he doesn't own the rights there. He signed a participation agreement, whatever he signed at the time to be on the U.S. Olympic team. And then the broadcast rights were sold to, I believe, ABC Sports. And so this whole contract and the distribution of the contract rights and the image rights through the ecosystem. However, if Jim Craig were around and we were to revisit that whole joining the being selected for and joining Herb Brooks' hockey team in 2022, might he want to review that agreement more carefully? Might he want to stake a claim to his name, image, likeness and license that through the blockchain, whereby he'd at least, now he may decide that his negotiating power is not sufficiently strong and he could lose his place as the goalie of the team, or he might already be famous and stand his ground and say, no, there will be a lot of eyes watching me play, and you will want me on that team because I'm going to drive more broadcast interest, more eyes, more viewer eyes. But for me to be on this team, here's how I'm going to negotiate my name, image, likeness rights, right? So that's a famous person, but if you were to apply that to NCAA, the University of Oregon just put out a new program where they're looking to promote their players and the players' ability to generate revenue. These players may not have much brand recognition, but their brand will grow as part of the team. And so why doesn't the team promote that program and promote their athletes, and everyone benefits through the licensing of name, image, likeness rights?
Okay. So when we're talking about what happened in the NCAA, and you could even as an extension do the class action lawsuit, depending on the upgrade of the results of that, the professional women's sports, including the Williams sisters and the entire women's soccer team in the US, which is ostensibly better than the men's, but paid less. Those are anomaly examples of when those in majority minoritized groups are benefiting from the law. But so I always look at who is most vulnerable when we enact something like this, especially if we're talking about data property, sorry, not data privacy we're talking here. And specifically, there are groups that are, first of all, we know Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are investing in cryptocurrency at a rate of at least double white Americans. And like that to me is always a red flag that maybe they are getting ripped off and being sold snake oil because they are more vulnerable. In general, anytime you give, whether even all the way back to sex work, and which still exists today, but if you give someone who has no money an opportunity to make money, they will choose that over their children starving, etc. People that are digitally illiterate, which at least in the UK, I think it's 1 in 6 are essentially digitally illiterate. How are they protected, or how are they more at risk in this model where an individual can sell their data as property?
Yeah, I mean, I would start my answer by saying that, first of all, this is an emerging space and it's very dynamic. There need to be more institutions involved. Laws have to be modified. Are there exploitation risks? Absolutely. Is cryptocurrency already susceptible to defrauding and criminal activity? Yes, that's occurring. I think that's one reason why we're having this conversation, is be part of that dialogue on the opportunities and some of the improvements that are needed. I think that there's a collective responsibility around managing risk to data. And what I mean is there's this notion around with the emergence of blockchain, the emergence of opportunities in name, image, likeness. A number of universities are looking at data trusts, which is another a different area that looks to bring together those who have collective interests so that enforcement of ownership can be done at scale. So is the implicit in what I'm describing, and we didn't get into the enforcement, I'll just mention it briefly, that a property framework is, in my judgment, more readily enforceable because of the more established and more tangible interests as well as the laws around property as opposed to privacy. With data and digital identity, there is a need for enforcement. There's absolutely need for enforcement. The ones who are most at risk, will be the digital illiterate, those without the means to utilize the greater enforcement mechanisms of property law. And I think that's where data trusts enter. So it's the collective the collective body that identifies the commonality of interest and then looks at ways to enforce rights.
Okay, that's what a data trust is then. Okay. Among the digitally illiterate are often those making the regulations. It wasn't that long ago when Mark Zuckerberg was in front of Congress and a congressman wasted everyone's time on C-SPAN by asking, what is the difference between Twitter and Facebook? These are digitally illiterate people running some of the government. Where is there any momentum towards filling the knowledge gap of the general public and of those that are in the position to create regulations? The US is behind, California less so, I guess, than Europe in this area significantly. And even that with GDPR, we're about 4 years into it and enforcement is bleak at best and long in time. So is there any momentum towards educating and hiring people to help in this area, or?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I mean, there are definitely think tanks, myself, others, are involved with trying to help with laws that need to be improved and so on. The dynamic, Jennifer, that's afoot is that many of us, I'm in this category, we didn't grow up with the internet, right? And so now a number of improvements have occurred, but law always moves slower than technology. We first have to understand the environment we're dealing with. What I like, and I think that, and the challenge now is that we haven't gotten our arms around, at least many institutions, legislative bodies, we're struggling with how to protect privacy. What we're talking about here, in my view, is that we're pursuing a legacy approach that's obsolete in the internet era. And so if we pivot away from privacy, not entirely, because there is the human rights dimension, it's a broad notion, but if we move toward identity and move toward property, I think we'll strategically be on a better pathway. And again, getting the blockchain is already architected and designed around this property model. Like we talk about crypto assets, we talked about NFTs, not just cryptocurrency. It's already set up the infrastructure, and with smart contracts under some systems, part of it, it's already set up under a property model. And so actually converting and looking at digital identity protected as an asset class with the blockchain, I think it'll facilitate this conversation and this movement toward property law, not to the complete exclusion of privacy law, because again, these notions of human rights notions, privacy has value, but I think it's all better enforced under a property framework.
For those that are listening and don't know what blockchain is, can you explain it briefly in the concept maybe of using it as an analogous to property?
Sure. And again, I'll do a high level, just
You don't want to go
for
deep
purpose.
dive
Yeah.
of the tech.
It is essentially a distributed ledger. I mean, there's more to it than that, but in so many ways, it's a way of tracking transactions on a distributed model versus a centralized model. And what that's then enabled is the creation of these digital assets. And of course, we have digital currency, cryptocurrency, and the like. But there's also, I guess I'm glad you asked this question because it causes me to mention this. We start off talking about, one, protect your assets, two, if you choose to monetize, there's that option, and the distributed ledger enables that. But NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and particularly utility tokens, there's different types of tokens on the blockchain. Some are collectibles and they appreciate in value, and whether that's an investment, that's a whole separate legal, controversy around that. But what I'm referring to is a utility token, meaning it's my digital identity token, and I own my identity, and where I choose to license it, that comes through the utility token.
Okay. Now, what happens when Google gets rid of cookies and decides what data anyone gets? How does that is blockchain and NFTs or utility tokens, as you said, big enough to go against Google or with? I don't know.
I think all of an awful lot of technology companies, like Meta, formerly Facebook, there's a lot of effort moving toward blockchain. I don't think blockchain is considered by many to be essential to Web3. We are moving toward Web3. Blockchain will be part of it. Whether and parties that have influence, that have power, there will always be an effort to pursue their interest. That's understood. But the structure of the blockchain being decentralized enables more innovation, more opportunities, less centralized control. So I think the pathway is toward more decentralization and more opportunity for individuals, but there is a real imperative to stake your claim. I mean, you can't go down the monetization path until you first stake your claim. And I think the risk, even with blockchain, a decentral, with every revolution, there are new risks posed, and there are an awful lot of risks with blockchain as well. So to your earlier point about education and legislation, I think moving toward property is a good step, but there's a lot to be done, and it's going to have to be done pretty quickly because Web3 is happening fast.
Fascinating, all very fascinating. So it's happening very fast, but it's not the MO yet, for sure. What does the average business need to do now to take those first steps towards preparing? How do you wrap your mind around this as a business owner or leadership?
Sure. I mean, there are experts out there that can help advise companies to put together, I wouldn't even call it blockchain or crypto. I think it's a Web3 strategy. But and we didn't even get into it, but with 5G, I mean, everything is happening faster. The threats are coming faster. Having a strategy is essential as the internet is undergoing change. So a strategy toward protection of data and data assets, and if it makes sense, movement toward monetization of those assets.
Okay. What is that first step to do those steps or protect that? Or what can a business do to get on this pathway if they choose to?
I think they've got to, I mean, if they don't have internal expertise, it's forming a strategy group, right? And so whether that's internal or you bring external sources, certainly I'll use that as a prompt for me. I'm always available to help, but there's many others out there as well that can help a company design a Web3 strategy. I think it starts with informing, understanding the changes afoot and what are the opportunities and what are the risks.
Which, of course, it's risk protection to get knowledge, prepare yourself to not be left behind if there's a massive shift that switches very soon. Wow, Doug, we could be talking about this all day. I have so many questions that I'll ask for you later, but we have limited time. There's so much emerging information and such a desperate need to work out the data privacy or data property issue. If our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, your services, and certainly when they likely have more questions, what's the best way to get in touch?
Sure. They can go through either our global. I'm available through that. I've got a LinkedIn profile, and then eosedgelegal.com is on the internet. So you can find me that way. And always interested in having conversations in this space, looking for opportunities, looking to help out. I really appreciate your this dialogue we've had, Jennifer. Hopefully it's been informative to the audience.
And certainly to me. So thank you so much, Doug, and thank you, listeners. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. These trusted advisors with extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals need to know about, and likely today maybe didn't know about. To learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it. Thank you all so much.